August 15, 1945. The tropical sun blazed across the dusty parade ground of Camp Kennedy in Texas as 23-year-old Yumiko Tanaka squinted against the brilliant glare. The young woman, formerly a communications specialist with the Imperial Japanese Navy, stood completely frozen in disbelief. Before her strode a figure that, according to everything she had been taught, simply could not exist, at least not in this form. 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders like mountain ranges and hands that could encompass her entire face, the American Guard moved with a casual confidence that defied 17 years of careful indoctrination. "It cannot be real," she whispered to Akiko Yamamoto, the former nurse standing beside her. "They told us American men were weak, stunted creatures, half-starved beasts barely capable of standing upright." What Yumiko witnessed defied 19 years of Imperial propaganda, men who seemed carved from solid oak, towering figures who moved with the casual strength of those who had never known true hunger. In that moment, as the Texan guard tipped his hat with a smile revealing perfect white teeth, Yumiko understood the first of many lies that had led her nation to absolute ruin. The Imperial education system had prepared Japanese citizens for victory through carefully constructed mythology about their enemies. From elementary school primers to military training manuals, Americans were portrayed as physically inferior specimens, the product of racial mixing, poor diet, and moral degradation. Japanese schoolchildren learned that the average American male stood several inches shorter than his Japanese counterpart, suffered from chronic malnutrition, and lacked the spiritual fortitude necessary for prolonged military conflict. Military instructors specifically targeted female personnel with tales of American masculine inadequacy, warning that capture meant facing subhuman creatures whose physical weakness was matched only by their moral depravity. This propaganda emerged from calculated strategy by Japanese military leadership, who recognized that the industrial capacity of the United States posed an existential threat to imperial ambitions. Rather than acknowledge American material superiority, authorities emphasized supposed spiritual and physical superiority of the Japanese people. General Hideki Tojo himself approved educational materials claiming that American men suffered from calcium deficiencies due to their dairy-heavy diets, resulting in brittle bones and diminished stature. Naval intelligence briefings included assessments that the average American serviceman weighed 30 pounds less than their Japanese counterpart due to the softening effects of capitalist excess medical instructors in the Imperial Army, taught that American men reached physical maturity later and began physical decline earlier than Japanese men, creating a narrower window of combat effectiveness. These falsehoods found fertile ground in a population with limited exposure to foreigners. In 1941, less than 2% of Japanese citizens had ever encountered an American in person. Most Japanese women, particularly those from rural areas like Yumiko, had never seen a Westerner outside of carefully selected propaganda photographs that deliberately portrayed physically unimpressive subjects. The Japanese Ministry of Information maintained strict control over all media depicting foreigners, selecting images that reinforce the narrative of Western physical inferiority. In civilian defense, preparedness pamphlets distributed in 1942, American soldiers were illustrated as stooped, narrow-shouldered figures barely able to carry their equipment. The geographical isolation of Japan reinforced these misconceptions. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, who later documented the psychological impact of American material abundance on Japanese prisoners, noted that our island mentality created a vacuum in which fantastical beliefs about foreigners could flourish unchallenged. By 1944, as the Pacific War turned against Japan, propaganda regarding American physical inferiority intensified. Food shortages on the home islands provided an opportunity to reframe deprivation as spiritual strength. Government radio broadcasts claimed that American soldiers required 3 times the daily caloric intake of their Japanese counterparts, presenting this as evidence of inefficiency rather than superior supply chains. As civilian rations dwindled to less than 1,200 calories daily in urban areas, Propaganda emphasized that such disciplined consumption created superior warriors compared to overfed, sluggish Americans. For female military personnel like Yumiko and Akiko, this propaganda carried additional dimensions. Military nurses, communications specialists, and support staff received specific briefings on the degenerative physiology of American men. They showed us charts purporting to demonstrate that American men had lower testosterone levels, weaker musculature, and poorer reflexes, recalled Midori Sato, a Navy nurse captured in the Philippines. We were told their bones broke under minimal pressure, that they cried easily, and that a single Japanese soldier could overpower 3 Americans in hand-to-hand combat. Female personnel were particularly targeted with these messages as they were considered more vulnerable to capture in the event of a mainland invasion. The reality that awaited Japanese prisoners of war in American custody would systematically dismantle these carefully constructed falsehoods. The journey of discovery began for most Japanese female prisoners during the initial capture and transport to detention facilities. Yumiko Tanaka's first encounter with American military personnel occurred on August 10, 1945, when her communications unit was captured during the final days of fighting on Okinawa. Her first written observation, preserved in a diary later donated to the National Museum of the Pacific War, described the impossible size of the Marine sergeant who processed her capture. He stood taller than any man I had ever seen, with arms like tree trunks and a chest so broad it seemed to belong to a different species, she wrote. When he offered me water, his canteen looked like a child's toy in his hand. I feared he would crush my fingers when he helped me into the transport vehicle for Akiko Yamamoto, captured after the hospital where she worked was overrun by American forces. The initial shock came from the casual display of physical strength. 2 American soldiers lifted a medical cabinet that had required 4 of our orderlies to move, she recounted in a 1963 interview. They did this while laughing and carrying on a conversation, as if moving such weight required no special effort. I remember thinking that perhaps these were specially selected soldiers meant to intimidate us. But later, I saw that such physical capability was common among them. The transportation of prisoners to holding facilities provided further evidence contradicting Imperial propaganda. Sadako Kimura, a communications specialist captured in the Philippines, described her first meal in American custody. They gave each of us a ration pack containing more food than I had seen in 3 months. When I hesitated to eat what seemed like an enormous quantity, the guard appeared confused and said, "That's just lunch, ma'am." He spoke as if this abundance was the most ordinary thing in the world. This casual relationship with abundance extended to the American military equipment. Keiko Nakamura, a former clerk with the Japanese 14th Area Army, noted in her post-war memoir that their transport vehicles were so numerous, so well-maintained, and consumed fuel so prodigally that I began to understand we had been fighting a different kind of war altogether. The first extended exposure to American men came during medical processing at reception centers. Nurse Fumiko Tanaka recalled her shock when a medical officer measured incoming American personnel alongside Japanese prisoners. The American doctor was recording weights for new guard personnel, and I saw figures that seemed impossible: 90 kilograms, 100 kilograms, some even more, with heights regularly exceeding 180 centimeters. These were not exceptional specimens, but ordinary drafted men. The physical examinations of prisoners themselves revealed the disparity in health and nutrition. Fumiko noted that the average weight of female Japanese military personnel in her processing group was 43 kilograms, while American nurses of similar age and height typically weighed 58 to 63 kilograms. Captain James Henderson, the medical officer overseeing the reception center at Camp Kennedy, documented the reaction of Japanese female prisoners to American physical standards. Many expressed disbelief when informed they were classified as malnourished by our standards, he wrote in his quarterly report. Several became visibly distressed when shown height-weight charts indicating they fell significantly below normal parameters for women of their age. One prisoner, upon learning that her normal diet in Japan provided roughly half the calories considered minimum by American standards, accused our interpreter of deliberate mistranslation. The journey from reception centers to permanent detention facilities deepened this cognitive dissonance. Midori Sato described her train journey from California to a camp in Colorado. For 3 days, we traveled through landscapes of impossible abundance, endless fields of crops, vast herds of cattle, orchards stretching to the horizon. At each stop, I saw robust civilians going about their business. Not just military personnel carefully selected for propaganda purposes, but ordinary people who appeared well-fed and healthy. Children were particularly shocking. American children seemed a head taller than Japanese children of the same age, with round faces and energetic movements that spoke of complete nutritional security. Upon arrival at permanent detention facilities, Japanese female prisoners encountered the daily reality of American abundance. Camp Livingston in Louisiana, which housed several hundred Japanese women, became a laboratory of cultural shock. Lieutenant Emily Rosenberg, who served as women's barracks supervisor, recorded the reactions. The new arrivals could not comprehend the standard rations. When informed they would receive 3,000 calories daily, one prisoner became so agitated we needed to call a translator to confirm there hadn't been a misunderstanding. She insisted such quantities would be impossible to consume and must represent weekly rather than daily allocations. The shower facilities proved another revelation. Akiko Yamamoto's first experience with American plumbing was documented in letters she was permitted to send to her family in occupied Japan in 1946. The water flows without interruption, hot water in seemingly infinite supply. When I asked the guard how long we were permitted to shower, she appeared confused by the question. "Until you're clean," she said. The concept of unlimited hot water was so foreign, I stood frozen, unable to comprehend such luxury. Similar reactions were recorded regarding toilet facilities, electrical lighting, and climate control systems that maintained comfortable temperatures regardless of external weather conditions. Perhaps most destabilizing to Imperial propaganda were the casual encounters with American civilian workers at the camps. Yumiko Tanaka's diary contains repeated references to the physical stature of maintenance personnel, cooks, and administrative staff. "Today, I observed a delivery of supplies," she wrote in September 1945. 3 civilian men unloaded crates that would require 5 or 6 of our strongest men to move. They performed this labor while conversing about a baseball game, sweating freely, but showing no signs of extraordinary exertion. These were not soldiers, but ordinary workers, yet each stood over 175 centimeters tall with proportional physical development. The camp kitchens became particular sites of revelation. Lieutenant Rosenberg noted that Japanese prisoners assigned to kitchen duty expressed continual amazement at the quantities and varieties of food prepared daily. Sadako Kimura, who worked in the Camp Livingston kitchen for 6 months, later described the experience. "The waste alone was shocking. Each day we discarded more edible food than my entire neighborhood in Osaka would consume in a week." When I mentioned this to the head cook, he shrugged and said it was normal to prepare extra to ensure nobody went without. The concept that excess was preferable to scarcity contradicted everything we had been taught about American resource limitations. For many Japanese women, the most profound contradiction of imperial propaganda came through observation of off-duty American personnel. Keiko Nakamura described watching a baseball game between guards. They moved with such power and speed, throwing the ball distances that seemed impossible, running bases with explosive energy. These were ordinary soldiers engaged in recreation, yet their physical capabilities exceeded what our propaganda had claimed was possible for even elite American troops. I remembered posters showing Americans as spindly, weak-limbed creatures and felt a deep sense of betrayal watching these men leap and run with casual strength. Weekend activities provided further evidence of American physical capacity. Yumiko's diary entry from October 19, 1945, described a scene that fundamentally contradicted her understanding of American masculinity. Today, I observed several guards engaged in what appeared to be recreational lumber cutting. For sport, they took turns cutting through logs using axes and saws, competing for speed. The winner, a man named Johnson from Oregon, cut through a log 30 centimeters thick in less than 2 minutes using only a hand axe. He was not visibly exhausted afterward and joined a foot race immediately following the competition. These are the men we were told lacked physical endurance. The cognitive dissonance created by these observations manifested in various ways among the prisoners. Camp records from 1945 and 46 document numerous instances of Japanese women requesting medical examinations of American personnel, apparently seeking scientific confirmation of what their eyes witnessed. Major Walter Simmons, camp physician at Fort Sill, noted, "Several female prisoners have independently requested information about American nutritional standards, specifically asking if guards receive special dietary supplements or hormonal treatments. They appear genuinely perplexed by the physical development of average American personnel. As Japanese prisoners gained limited access to newspapers, magazines, and educational materials, they encountered statistics that rendered Imperial propaganda not merely wrong, but absurdly, catastrophically mistaken. The overwhelming evidence began with food production statistics. Yumiko Tanaka, who kept a notebook of impossible numbers she discovered during her detention, recorded her first encounter with American agricultural output. Today, we were given a reading exercise from an agricultural report. It stated that in 1944, while Japan struggled to feed its population, American farmers produced 198 million metric tons of milk, 11 million metric tons of poultry, and nearly 83 million metric tons of beef. These figures cannot be correct. They would mean each American could consume several times the protein available to Japanese citizens. When I questioned the instructor, thinking there must be a translation error, she confirmed the numbers and seemed puzzled by my disbelief. Camp newspapers produced for American personnel, but sometimes shared with prisoners, provided further evidence of industrial capacity that defied comprehension. Keiko Nakamura preserved a clipping reporting that Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point plant produced more steel in January 1946 than all of Japan's factories combined in the entire year of 1945. Perhaps most shocking were the comparative statistics regarding military production. Midori Sato recorded a lecture given by an American officer about wartime manufacturing. He mentioned casually that in 1944, America produced more than 96,000 aircraft. When one prisoner audibly gasped, the officer paused, seemingly confused by the reaction. For context, Japan's total aircraft production in our best year was approximately 28,000. The officer then noted that America's aircraft production was actually considered somewhat disappointing compared to their targets. Several prisoners around me were visibly shaken. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run bomber plant became a particular focus of disbelief. When prisoners learned that this single facility produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak production, a complete 4-engine heavy bomber with over 1,600,000 parts, several demanded verification. Lieutenant Rosenberg noted that a group of former communications specialists created a detailed timeline to prove such production rates impossible, only to abandon the project when confronted with photographic evidence and production records. One woman became so distressed she required medical attention, apparently experiencing something like grief as her worldview collapsed. Comparisons of everyday consumption revealed equally stark disparities. Sadako Kimura, working in camp administration, gained access to supply requisition forms and began tracking the materials allocated for prisoner maintenance compared to Japanese civilian standards. Each prisoner receives 200 grams of soap monthly, equal to a Japanese family's yearly ration in 1944. The physical transformation of prisoners themselves provided irrefutable evidence of American material advantage. Camp medical records show that Japanese female prisoners gained an average of 4.5 kilograms during their first 6 months in detention, despite maintaining activity levels similar to their military service. Height measurements of younger prisoners showed continued growth that had been stunted under wartime rationing. Dental records reveal that 73% of Japanese female prisoners required significant dental work upon arrival, with American dentists frequently expressing shock at the poor oral health of women in their 20s and 30s. By mid-1946, the overwhelming evidence had produced a psychological transformation among Japanese female prisoners that camp authorities noted with interest. Reports from psychological evaluations document a progression from initial disbelief through anger to a form of resigned acceptance that fundamentally altered their worldviews. The psychological transformation began with denial. Camp records from late 1945 show that 68% of Japanese female prisoners initially attributed American physical development and material abundance to special preparations for propaganda purposes. Lieutenant Rosenberg noted frequent inquiries about whether the food served to prisoners was typical of American military rations or specially enhanced for psychological impact. For some, denial gave way to anger directed at Japanese authorities who had misinformed them so catastrophically. Yumiko Tanaka's journal from January 1946 contains a passage of remarkable bitterness. If our leaders knew the true nature of American industrial capacity, they sent us to slaughter like ignorant cattle. If they did not know, they were criminally incompetent. There is no third possibility that allows them honor. As news from occupied Japan reached the camps, prisoners learned of food shortages and continuing hardship in their homeland, creating painful contrast with their own improving conditions. Keiko Nakamura wrote to her sister in Kyoto, "The cruel irony is that I, a prisoner of our enemy, now eat better, sleep more comfortably, and have access to better medical care than you, a loyal citizen in our homeland. Something is fundamentally wrong with a world ordered this way." The camp at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, introduced many prisoners to another American archetype that propaganda had rendered mythical. The cowboy weekend rodeo exhibitions by local ranchers provided visceral demonstrations of American physical capability that contradicted Imperial education. Yumiko's diary entry from April 7, 1946, captures her amazement. Today, we observed American cowboys demonstrating cattle management techniques. These men, who apparently represent ordinary rural workers rather than elite soldiers, performed physical feats that seemed impossible. One man wrestled a bull weighing perhaps 700 kilograms to the ground using only his body weight and technique. Another controlled a galloping horse while standing upright on its back. Their casual mastery of massive animals contradicted everything we were taught about American physical capability. For prisoners held in northwestern camps, encounters with lumberjacks proved similarly destabilizing. Akiko Yamamoto, temporarily transferred to a Washington state facility, described watching forestry operations near the camp. The men moved among enormous trees, wielding saws and axes with practiced ease. One particularly large American, named Peterson, according to the guards, carried logs that would require 4 Japanese men to lift. When I asked if he was some kind of champion or specially selected for strength, the guard laughed and said he was just a regular logger. If these represent regular American workers, what does that make the men we were told could barely carry their own equipment? The evidence mounted in ways large and small, from the casual abundance of American cigarettes to the ubiquity of personal automobiles among even junior camp staff. When repatriation began in earnest during 1947, former prisoners carried back not just improved health and technical knowledge, but fundamentally altered expectations about what modern society could and should provide its citizens. The most immediate impact came through agricultural practices. Women like Midori Sato, who had observed American farming techniques, returned to rural communities with specific knowledge of crop rotation, fertilizer application, and mechanization possibilities. Agricultural production in regions with significant numbers of returned prisoners showed measurable improvements by 1949, with rice yields increasing by 11 to 17% compared to pre-war averages. Though working within severe material constraints, these women applied American principles of efficiency and abundance-oriented thinking to existing resources. In urban areas, former prisoners like Keiko Nakamura found roles in reconstruction planning that emphasized American standards of infrastructure. As an architectural clerk with the Tokyo Reconstruction Authority, she advocated successfully for wider streets, more robust electrical capacity, and improved water systems based directly on her observations of American facilities. "We cannot immediately match American material abundance," she wrote in a 1948 planning document. "But we can design with eventual abundance in mind, rather than perpetuating scarcity-based thinking." The medical profession particularly benefited from returned nurses who had observed American practices. Akiko Yamamoto, who resumed nursing in Osaka in 1948, introduced sterilization protocols and patient care standards based on her camp experiences. Hospital records from facilities employing former prisoners show more rapid adoption of American medical innovations and improved patient nutrition programs. The psychological transformation experienced by these women influenced Japan's emerging consumer culture and industrial philosophy. Sadako Kimura, who established a small textile manufacturing business in 1953, explicitly modeled her production approach on American principles observed during detention. We begin by asking what abundance would look like in our context, rather than how to manage scarcity effectively. Even with limited resources, this perspective fundamentally changes decision-making. The influence extended to family structures and child-rearing practices. Women who had experienced American detention were more likely to emphasize nutrition, education, and health care in family resource allocation. Their children received more years of schooling on average, were more likely to pursue technical and professional careers, and showed greater height and weight compared to demographic peers. We needed to see abundance with our own eyes to believe it was possible, Yumiko Tanaka reflected in a 1971 interview. "The most valuable thing I brought back to Japan was not knowledge of specific techniques, but the unshakable certainty that scarcity was a temporary condition, not an inevitable state." For Yumiko Tanaka, who would later serve as a cultural liaison for Japanese businesses expanding into American markets, the Cowboys and Lumberjacks who had so shocked her in 1945 became symbols of a larger truth. They revealed that physical strength comes not from spiritual discipline alone, but from material security and scientific understanding, she wrote in her memoir, published in 1978. Japan's recovery required embracing this lesson. Abundance creates strength rather than weakness, and prosperity serves national power more effectively than sacrifice. In a final historical irony, by 1980, many of the women who had once marveled at American height, weight, and physical development lived to see Japanese children reach comparable physical dimensions within 2 generations of improved nutrition and health care. The transformation they had witnessed in American detention camps had come full circle, with Japan achieving living standards that rivaled and sometimes exceeded those of their former captors. What had seemed impossible in August 1945 had become ordinary reality within a single lifetime. Years later, in 1993, Yumiko Tanaka would return to Camp Kennedy for a reconciliation ceremony. Standing on the same parade ground where she had first witnessed those impossible American men, now an elderly woman who had seen her country transform beyond recognition, she reflected on the journey that August day in 1945, when I saw the American Guard who defied everything I had been taught to believe, was the first day of Japan's true modernization. We had to lose a war to gain a future. We had to see abundance to believe it possible. And some of us had to become prisoners to truly become free. Thank you for following this remarkable story of transformation and discovery. If this journey moved you, please subscribe for more untold stories. Leave a like and share with others who appreciate history. See you next time.